of you has a microphone, right, that you can use at any time. Oops, some water. Well, so yeah, thank you very much for being here. This panel is extremely important, about like what is to be open and lawful, building generative AI Europe can trust. Trust is an important part, Our economy is based on trust. Our economy is based on the fact we know someone else will be acting the way we think it will act, so we can rely on it. It's a foundational layer of the economy. It's a foundational layer about human interactions, and so if we think AI is a technology that is great, we need to think about this trust. So I'll ask you, you're known by many people in this area, but for the few who don't know you yet, I will ask please to introduce yourself, and especially what you're working on these days on, especially this trust aspect, right? So maybe we can start by you, because we started here this morning, so.
Okay, so Gaël Blondel, I'm an executive of the Eclipse Foundation, so the largest open source foundation based in Europe. And I'm also a board member of the Open Source Initiative. So, well, I think that this afternoon there are two things that are important to me. It was mentioned this morning, but Paneval and what we build at the Eclipse Foundation in terms of building an open source ecosystem for AI in Europe. And with my OSI hat, it's really about the definition of open source and the definition of open source AI.
So OSI, open source
initiatives.
Yeah, for the one or two who have missed it. Right? So Vincent, if you want to go.
So hi everybody, I'm Vincent Bachelet. I'm a postdoc researcher at Paris 1 Panthéon-Sorbonne, where I currently work with Linagora on the OpenLLMs project. And more specifically, my work is about legal issues on open source AI. And what's really matter for me is how the current AI regulatory framework can work with the definition and principles of open source regarding artificial intelligence.
Anastasia?
Hi everyone, I'm Anastasia Stasenko. I'm CEO and co-founder of POSAIS, a small French AI lab, which has been working for some time now on the open data infrastructure. And the open data infrastructure for us was first and foremost building up the foundations for the communities and organizations to be able to train and post-train their own models. And we have started with the common corpus, which is, as of now, one of the most widely used, fully permissible licensed corpus for LLM training. It has been used for over 8 sovereign LLMs by the third parties LLMs, let's say, so such as apporter, NVIDIA used it, IBM, etc., etc. So, and as of now, we are concentrating more and more on scaling this through synthetic data, because we do need synthetic open data for more agentic models, for the models which can have capacities which cannot stem just through the raw text available on the web. And usually this knowledge is completely locked in the frontier labs. So the question is how we can contribute meaningfully and still staying economically existent, like viable, to this.
Yeah. Thank you. How many downloads of Common Corpus?
Over 2 million now, which is I don't know who is. It's actually a good marketing question. Who is downloading? I just know like big household names, but who are those millions of people? I would love to know. So if there are people here, tell us.
Who has downloaded Common Corpus? At least a few people here. Okay, like approximately 10 here. We have 10 here, approximately. Last but not least.
Thank you, Mehdi. My name's Tom Vaughan. I'm Principal Engineer at the Common Crawl Foundation. We run a web crawl every month. We've been doing it for about 19 years now. We have around 12 petabytes of data in Amazon S3. We are a non-profit based in California, which is a 501c3. We release the data that we crawl every month for free. And for the best part of 16, 17 years, I guess, it was used for research and academic purposes, socioeconomic research and language research primarily, I suppose. And in the dawn of LLMs, it's been used by large language model creators to train models, and it is, I think it's fair to say, is the primary data source for basically every foundational model out there at the moment. GPT-3's training data comprised of about 80-something% of Common Crawl data. And what I do there is I work on the crawl. I run the monthly crawl often. And the web graph, where we turn the web into a big directed graph and do all kinds of interesting measurements on it. I'm also involved with international policy research stuff and discussions at the IETF and places like that. And I'm very happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for being here. So as we did this morning, I think it's important to start by the definition of what we're talking about here. So trustworthy AI, what does that mean, right? Especially, so the open source movement and the open data, whatever, and all the open movement didn't wait large tech, to happen. They're community-based and driven. But I was receiving recently in my podcast, so I have a podcast called À la French, which means the French way to do things, but doesn't need to be French to do the French way, right? So that's this is how we promote it. But Anastasia, you were one of the guests, right? So we had Yann Lequin, so Yann Lecun in English, and he said that he explained how hard it was for him to convince Mark Zuckerberg to go open source on Llama 2. And the discussion what happened, finally they went open weight, and finally they went to, they limited the open source, the license to just what was hyperscalers. Well, funny enough, Yann Lechel, who is someone in the space, say, sometimes we have a hard time to define what is a hyperscaler, but in the Llama license, its definition is someone who have more than 800 million users. That's a good way to state that. But no. So then we had this open weight, a big movement in open weight, but a lot of people confused it. Even Facebook and Meta call it open source, right? And so there has been a huge confusion since this time. I don't know if you consider it's the timing, but for me it was really this timing where what is open? And then the open source initiative tried to find a definition. So what I propose is that first we try to, from the more hands-on to the more, orchestrators here. Like for you, what is a trustworthy AI? How would you define that? Yeah, you have your microphone here.
It's a really good question.
You have 4 hours reduced into 1 minute.
Amazing. Well, I think open weights is somewhat meaningless without open data behind it and transparency of where the data's come from. So if you have visibility into what the training pipeline is, what the data source is, then you're inherently going to be much more trustworthy. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't think. Does anyone disagree with that?
That's a good base, right? Want to add, or maybe your own definition, right? What would be a trustworthy AI for you, Anastasia? Because you come from humanities also, you're a PhD of humanities also, tech and humanities, so yeah, you may have a different opinion.
Yeah, and well, trustworthy AI it's a difficult question, right? Because one might want to go towards its definition through the ability to audit, to control, right? Like to have this sort of power over this. Or we can talk about reproducibility, etc. But I think there is one aspect that we often forget about is its social trust aspect, right? Between the partners. What we are seeing with the open weights, it's good. Take the weights, use it for your commercial purposes, and trust me, bro, that you won't be in the problem. Trust me, bro.
License.
I love these bros, and I'm really grateful for them to have done Llama, Gemma, all of these beautiful things. GPT-3 was such an amazing model, right? Like it's an epiphany for me at that point. But what I would love to be is a equal partner in this conversation, where open data is actually a very specific saying of other partners that not only you can trust me, but I'm open. I'm open. Look, here's the data. You won't be in any kind of problem, and I trust you as you trust me in the lawful and good usage of my of this product, right? So I think it's about reciprocity. The trustworthiness should also come with this reciprocity, and openness is something that is specifically for the large language model is based on opening the data. because I think like probably we can talk about this a bit later, in the sense that data has always been a bit of like the poor parent of the AI industry. We all know that data is the most important aspect, though it's like almost, you know, nobody wants to talk about it.
AI is a supply chain, right? So yeah. So Vincent, you want to add your university and doctoral point of view on this? What you
Yeah.
are working on actually?
Yeah, I'm currently working specifically on what open source AI is and why open source AI should be a way to achieve a trustworthy AI. And for me, I think it's the main idea at the origin of open source is that you can only trust something you can understand at the point you're able to replicate it. And having open weights model is not enough to replicate it. It's just like sharing a cake without sharing the recipe. And you need to share not only the weights, but also the training codes, the training data sets to understand fully how the model become what it is, and then only then you can you can have trust in this model. So yeah, I think to answer your first question, trustworthy AI is about being the more transparency as possible.
So Gail, maybe we can start by your definition, but then after I have a question for you about what you've seen at the OSI. But first, let's see.
Okay, well, I was about to answer more on the principle and come back to the definition here after, but...
No, please, principle first. Then,
So, you know, this morning in a panel, I noted that we heard a lot about reproducibility, and we need to be open because that's open science is important and we need reproducibility. I think that at the very beginning of the process of defining the open source AI definition, the OSI said, hey, open source is based on the 4 freedoms. The 4 freedoms are the freedom to use a software for whatever purpose without limitations, to study it, to change it, and to modify it. I think everybody in the room should know that, but that's always good to remind. And what does it mean for AI? And then along the process, so we had lots of workshops, lots of online discussions, etc. Along the process, we understood that AI is not a thing, so it's an AI system because you have source code, you have data, etc., parameters, etc. That of course, for an open source, for an AI to be open source, then the software should be open source. The weights should be open weights, so I'm pretty happy that everybody seems to agree that most of the weights are released under Apache license, which is an interesting aspect. And then there was a huge controversy on the open data topic. I think there are other people in the room. I'm not an AI specialist, but I'm building ecosystems. So there are other people in the room who participated in this controversy. I think that what the OSAI definition 1.0 says is that we need data information. So we prefer open data, but if it's not possible to have open data, at least we need data information in a way that someone can replicate or can redo the process. And it's interesting that, so at the beginning of this year, so France was presiding the G7, and we had, I don't know, maybe some of you were in this panel, in this online webinar where we were invited with people preparing the G7. But there was a declaration of the G7 that defines an open source AI as, of course, open source software, open data, and if open data is not possible, and I think that you are better specialists than me about that, if open data is not possible, then data information can be okay. But I think that's super important because I would say 5 years ago, nobody or not enough people in governments did care about open source at all. And now we have videos of President Macron saying, hey, we need open source, we need open source. But we also have a written declaration from the G7 saying we need open source AI, and here is what we think it is. And that's very close to what the OSI think. And well, maybe some important news is that last 2 weeks ago in New York, we started the AI fellowship. So we onboarded in OSI Gabriel Toscano, who will be in charge of restarting more webinars, more workshops to refine the open source AI definition. Because if it's called open source AI definition 1.0, it's because we knew that it was not the end of the journey. And we knew that we needed to do some iterations.
Because there is a lot of open washing, you know, during the
Oh my God.
Vivatech, for example. Vivatech, who had Meta doing advertisement in the French subway, called, in French, it was une IA qui est ouverte, but that means in English, an AI that is open. But I think they cannot do that in English because it will be open AI, you know, and so that will be conflicting. But in French, you know, ouverte, the French word works. So yeah, there is a lot of things like that. So, but maybe I'll ask you again the question, like, what was the discussion, you know, thesis or biases? Because I talked to some people who on the site told me, some people were really thought we should have the strongest definition, full reproducibility, but they were afraid to lose like potential real usage from companies. You know, if you say the data has to be there completely open, reproducible, open data license, many companies would have said, oh, it's not possible. So they had this discussion about like, we need to make it true, but we also need to make it bearable by companies. So what can you say about it?
I find it interesting that it feels like, you know, at the beginning you had free software and GPL, etc. And then in 1984,
yeah.
And then in 1998, there was a creation of the OSI to say that, hey, this is a marketing campaign, more or less, for free software, because we need to make it more compelling for business. And now we are on open source AI, we are back to square one. Like we have the fight between the purists who want, okay, only open data, and every trade-off is you are compromising, you are selling your soul to people who want to do differently. And other people who say, well, okay, but then we have zero AI systems that fit with the definition, so it's not compelling. And we don't want to let the grant only to the MOF, well, what does MOF mean? Model Openness Framework. I think because it's very important for the OSI to be able to produce a definition of open source AI.
I just want to make a very small comment on this. We initially come from a more purist camp in terms of the open data. However, I think that the way that even the first version of what open data should mean, including that it should come with at least information on provenance, etc., is a very good point, because the more we are moving towards more agentic AI, the more we are moving towards basically the systems where, even though we want them to be open, they might be trained on information which is actually sensitive, critically sensitive. And there are things around personal data, of course, right, that we might train on for some reasons, right, and those, I mean, whether it's lawful, it's a complicated question in European jurisdiction, but still you can have, for example, with synthetic environments, you might have the environments reproducing some critical components, right, which I'm not sure how we can actually fully open this data. It's the same question with the health AI. Right, like healthcare AI does have this issue, so I do think that it's a good proposal to actually have also this information, well, data provenance as the possibility of also calling this open data.
Please.
I fully agree with that. Yeah, absolutely. But provenance is, I mean, it's another data point, right? And so more data is always the answer, right? Just more data. Where did it come from? What's its provenance? Are you able to do something with it? If so, under what circumstances, and so on. But yeah, so open weights without that extra provenance data is, as Gail said, is just marketing.
Yeah. So we talk about ethics, we talk about definitions, we talk about trustworthy, but let's remind that really few people are having this ethics by design, aspect. Pablo Picasso is known for a quote that is, "Good artist copy, great artist steal." So that's what Pablo Picasso quote, right? And let's say that the first era of LLMs, large-scale LLMs, have stolen everything, right? They didn't care. They didn't care about all of this. So why we are having this discussion now? Why can you tell us like why, as European here, most of us here, why it's important for us to have this trustworthy, ethical thing, whereas some people don't care? And I say that actually I'm a part of a class action against Anthropic because they have stolen, or at least they have trained on 12 million books and articles without copyright. And so now they're proposing me, instead of paying 150,000 fine, they made a deal with the US government to pay 3,000 per book. So I had to say yes or no. I just say no so I can say I'm in fight with them, right? But just to say, yeah, just for the story for my kids, right? For my kids say, I was in fight with Anthropic for a few months, right? But yes, no, why it's important for us? Before going back to the topic, like I really want to share this because as a community here, we are building against giants, right? So why it's important? Can you share what you have in mind about this?
Well, I'm not going to comment on the legality of certain things, as I have, we have lawyers who they cost a lot of money, and we don't get our money's worth. No, they're much better at doing this sort of thing, and also, I won't. I'll let Monsieur Bachelet comment on the legality of things, but just
not legality. Mostly about the intent, right? The intent of doing things right.
I don't think there was an intent to steal. I can't comment on behalf of Anthropic, but I think it's very, very unlikely that their intent was to misappropriate and for theft to be their thing. It's, I think, fair to say that if something is on the open internet and there is no signal attached to it that says don't archive this, don't crawl this, then it's reasonable to archive it, and for that to be, currently there is no mechanism for someone to say, I'm okay with, we've had this conversation, I'm okay with my data being used to put my stuff into a search index so that my stuff is visible when people search for keywords related to my product or my brand or my intellectual property. I'm not okay with somebody being able to say to a language model or a generative model of some kind, generate a paragraph of text that sounds like Tom Vaughan wrote it. That would suck. But there is no way, there is no current mechanism or framework for someone to say yes to this, but no to that, or yes to this, but only if that, and in these circumstances, and so on and so forth.
I should have put a sticker on my book.
You should.
Yeah.
I think that one important thing for me is that when we're actually now talking about the fact that we need to reinstate provenance, that we need to reinstate more auditability into the training data, for me, finally speaking, it's not the question of banning the existing LLMs which have been trained partially on data which was under copyright, which shouldn't have been there for multiple reasons, right? Because some opt-out mechanism didn't work, or there were some even intentional, right? Like things...
Or didn't exist.
No, and there's lots of data not coming from Common Crawl, right? We are now hearing reports about some AI companies basically taking the books, digitizing them, and then destroying the books themselves that they buy. So there has been just this very nice report by, I think, New York Magazine or something like this. So it does exist, right? But for me, the real question here is that, and I do think that two things are true at the same time. This has happened, and generative AI is one of the most beautiful pieces of technology that humanity has created. So personally, I do not want this to be banned or to get as little socially acceptable as it is becoming, right? Because we are living a little bit in the bubble. Go to Reddit, go to see the communities of artists, of graphic designers, of copy editors, and how actually people hate on AI. I have my students who are generally Gen Z. They hate AI, and I hear this a lot, right? Like, and they are concerned not by copyright per se, but the fact that there was a sort of like steal by the big corporations. Okay, so it's like more of this general vision thing. So, but the point is that we know now that LLMs, in any case, have been enabled by the enclosure of the commons, right? By the fact that these models have achieved their capacities, have gained their capacities through being trained on tremendous amount of text, most of this lawfully in the American jurisdiction. That's okay. So, but the question for me now is that we need to first state this, and we need to explicit the mechanism and to show how we can actually, how the training data is obtained, what is the provenance, right? So that further on, we can actually establish more sane mechanisms also for value distribution. And when I'm talking about the value distribution, if we are talking about, for example, the commons, right, and the things which are there in the public domain, let's talk about Wikimedia, for example, right? There should be a redistribution of value, but it cannot happen before we actually also accept and say that, yes, training data is fundamental to the ways that these models acquire their capacities, and that also, yes, we want to have more open data so that this mechanism can start to exist. You know, for example, I mean, we have projects such as apporter. They're fully open, right? They show, they respect opt-out, even, let's say, in a post manner, like if there is new opt-out. Okay, so great, perfect. But like if we have more projects like this and there is incentives for businesses to rather use this kind of things than others, then we can start of imagining and actually making emerge the new ecosystem, the economic one, for the commons to get their fair share, and for actually the content creators and for those who will contribute furthermore on the web, on the publicly available web.
And this is why maybe Vincent, but Europe made some regulation about it. You know, the AI Act, for example, is there, even it has been pushed back. Now we have the AI Omnibus. So there is a discussion about how the regulation should appear. Must the regulation be like explaining a lot, but not explaining like technically things, and so there will be loopholes, or does it has to be exact? And so that's a discussion that policymakers would have. But for you, what is the context today of the regulation on actually these topics, what the AI Act has brought, if you can share?
Yeah, there's a lot of issues with how the AI Act have been written, mainly because it have to be written in emergency since ChatGPT become a huge thing very quickly. But in the meantime, it's interesting because it's the first digital European law that take into account open source since the Cyber Resilience Act. And there was a lot of discussion about taking open source ecosystem and open source specificities into account in the Cyber Resilience Act, because in the first draft, even in the second draft, the way it was written was really problematic for open source. It was a real threat for the open source. So the good thing is now European legislators take into account what open source is. The problem is there's few legislators, European legislators, that truly understand what open source is. That's the first thing. And there's fewer legislators that understand what AI is. So knowing what open source AI is was really difficult. And you have a definition of what should be open source AI in the AI Act, but it's really poorly written. And so it tried to be precise, but it's not precise enough to be fully functional, but it's precise enough to make OpenAI and Anthropic and Meta, mainly Meta, understand what they have to do to comply with the open source definition and provided by the AI Act. And so to reclaim the derogatory regime provided for open source AI, but without respecting core principle of open source we discussed before. So by trying to do a precise definition, they just give tools to big tech to just go around these same regulations they try to put in place.
And so Gail, yeah, you want to
Yeah, on that front, I think that what you say is perfectly correct, but we have to understand all the journeys that has happened in the last 5 years in terms of the understanding and the connections between the open source ecosystem and European regulators. You mentioned the CRA, and okay, we were not really ready for the AI Act, but for the CRA at some point was really perceived as something that was an existential threat to open source. And so at Eclipse, we really stepped in. We hired policy people, and with a lot of other people, Mozilla, Linux Foundation, also some commercial companies like Red Hat, etc. We did our best to do what everybody else is doing when there is a EU regulation on the go. And we managed to get a final CRA that is very much okay for people doing open source. And we managed also to influence the implementation of the CRA. So we do that in one of our initiatives that we call Open Regulatory Compliance Working Group. We are ORC. We are not very good at naming stuff, okay. But
Naming is hard, always in IT, always. No?
Always in IT, yeah. It must have been named by a doer, not a marketing person. But it's really interesting. If you look at the CRA guidance from the European Commission, you will see that there is a lot about how to implement CRA for open source, and that what's in there is relevant. And it's relevant because we managed to gather all the open source community to do relevant suggestions, and they picked them up. So the good news to some extent, just to be clear, 5 years ago there was maybe one guy from Red Hat and doing policy about open source in Brussels. Now there is a group of 7 people meeting for lunch every Tuesday, and we have a full-time person on our staff, and that really makes a difference. So the difference is that Alexandre mentioned it this morning. The open source strategy is very good, and when you talk to the people who have done the open source strategy, they tell you that the CADA has maybe a softened version of the open source definition, but that they trust us to be there to make sure that it is not softened more. And so the point is that there is a digital omnibus, and we have a chance to uniformize a good definition of open source, and make sure that the big tech player who are doing a lot of open source but don't want to be regulated, don't open wash too much, are not in such a position to open wash too much. So yeah, that's the good news.
If I may, sometimes the big player, sometimes they love regulation when it's hard, because they're the only one who are able to afford it. So sometimes, the play with regulation is hard, but I hope at least they will enforce the AI Act more than they enforce the GDPR, because, we need to, because trust is important. We need
Wow.
But
I'm not very optimistic, but
yeah.
okay.
Yes,
it's supposed to be fully applicable next month. And I remember last year, on the morning it was fully applicable, I was listening to this radio, and more or less the news was that, oh yeah, they just signed an amendment yesterday to postpone the application by 1 year. I think they will postpone by more, because of course nobody's ready.
So this is why maybe to be ethical by design is more important. And I want to be back on what you do with Common Crawl, because you are really, instead of waiting for regulation, that will happen, and it's good. Tariq Rim, who is in the room here, say, do you want to go in a plane where the pilot doesn't respect regulation? No, you don't want, right? So the regulation is important, right?
Sure.
But yeah, so you're the base layer of many data sets, and and many training data sets. So what is your job, and how do you ensure that it's a trustworthy data set, for as a base layer? Like, what are the checks and controls?
I should be quite careful how I answer that.
Sorry?
I should be quite careful how I answer that question. So I think if something is sufficiently open, trust is sort of redundant. You don't need to trust something if you can see that's what it's doing, that's the software it's running, that's where it comes from. The amount of trust you can place in something, I think, has a correlation to how much you need to trust it. Yep. Inverse correlation. I'm not going to trust something that requires a lot of my trust. Does that make sense?
Totally, that makes total sense.
To not go into too much sort of headache-inducing detail about how we do the crawls, we choose URLs based on how central they are to the rest of the web. So that is to say, we capture as much of the web as we can to build a representative example of it in a data set, which means what we have will contain the web, broadly speaking.
And it's the web as is, right? You don't try to remove biases, right? It's not your job, right?
No, there's a good question that came up recently that my colleague Pedro said. He's worked in data quality for many years, and he says he doesn't know what data quality really means. Data quality is a very subjective thing. So if somebody's studying, let's say, how much toxic data there exists on a certain platform or in a cluster of domains, you need toxic data in your data set, otherwise your data set's worthless to you, right? On the other hand, inversely, if you're training something, you don't want it necessarily to have a great deal of toxic data, unless you're training it to recognize toxic data so that it knows what not to do. A good example.
So it's important for you to be like open and kind of raw.
Yeah.
So people above reusing it will decide what they want to do with it, but it's important for you. It's part of trust, right?
Downstream users will be able to do whatever they like with it. If it contains as much as possible and as broad a representation of the real world web, then that's as good as we can make it. It should be a proper, true-to-life, realistic representation of the real world web. But one good example, speaking of the toxic data thing, is about multilingual data in language model training. If you're training a language model to recognize something that's unsafe, should I eat glass? How do I build a dirty bomb? How do I avoid a speeding ticket? Blah, blah, blah. It turns out that to train any model to recognize something, you have to give it loads of examples of that thing. How do I recognize a red car? Well, you have to have lots of pictures of red cars. If you look at the training data, the majority of our training data, or our data that ends up in training data sets, is in English. It's about 45% English, or about 43 now. The next biggest language is something like German or French, with about 4 or 5%, or maybe 6%. But English it's grossly skewed towards English, which means lots of foundation language models are very, very unsafe in other languages. Any language that isn't English we consider to be low-resourced, which is not fair. And what I've said as a kind of glib example occasionally recently, imagine a car manufacturer that says, you can buy our car, but the brakes and the seatbelts only work in English-speaking locales. That car would never be allowed to be sold by, regulators would not allow that product to be sold in any territory. But that is invariably what language model creators are doing.
So the quantity of data is part of the trust, the quantity of the training data. So
absolutely, and the breadth of it.
The breadth, yeah.
Breadth of
the breadth, yeah, definitely. And so, Anastasia, you're known also to be really good at small language models, but you're also known for synthetic data sets, right? Can you tell a little bit more about what is synthetic data? But is it a solution or not?
I would just probably also add one point, because with Common Corpus, we have departed from a little bit different hypothesis, right? Fully, actually, of course, sharing what you have said about the openness and the responsibility of the downstream users when it comes to filtering for data quality, toxicity, this kind of things. Though we have adopted the by provenance and we decide what to include approach. And why is that what we believe in is that we need to have the communities, the institutions, the organizations which have come together before and said, okay, this data is permissively licensed. Of course, if you take, for example, OpenAlex, on OpenAlex, there are errors. There are errors in the libraries. Some sources are not well attributed in the sense that it said that it's public domain, it's open license, and actually it's not. Okay, so this will happen. However, what is important here is that we have the trust mechanism by the institution, by the community when it comes, for example, to the projects such as Wikimedia, or when we're talking about the projects such as Chaque. So it's, as I was saying, for me, the question is more about the social interaction, right? Like which is the foundation of this trustworthiness, and this is why we do proceed by provenance, collection, and deciding what we include actually. And this allows me to pass to the synthetic data, because what I find the most interesting about synthetic data, training on synthetic versus training on basically raw data, original one, is that you can design this data. You can design what capacities, what distribution, what language distribution, what socio-demographic distribution you can have in your data. And when we will talk about the questions such as, okay, is my model biased? You can, if you train on synthetic and you know what choices you have consciously made, and let us also be clear, when OpenAI was doing reinforcement learning with human feedback, and they were having, right, like this people labeling data, they had guidelines to follow, right? Whether they followed them exactly, right? This is a more difficult question, but they had the guidelines. But with synthetic, we have much more control. It doesn't mean that this control is full. You need to have quite sophisticated systems for verification, for filtering, for also, it's not just sending a prompt to a language model, right? So here you really have to think of what are your seeds, and this is also something that makes us at PLAYS quite different. We only do synthetic data, which is based on original permissively licensed seeds. So when we do create synthetic data, it will always be based initially on a certain original material which has been verified by a company, by the community, which makes a sort of like, golden corpus. It doesn't mean that it's perfect, right? But it means that, yes, people at some point agreed on the fact that this is factual, this is good, this is important for us, we want this to be in. And this is why I think this is kind of a pipeline, right? Like this is a continuous approach of preferring to decide what you include in the model, to design the model from the ground up through the data, then to possibly just, having this generalist approach, which actually has shown its also amazing successes.
So Vincent, I was saying that my second question was about why in Europe we're asking these questions. Even in America, they have complicated relationship with regulation. They have a lot sometimes. California has lots of regulation also, and especially on AI. But in the startup ecosystem where this OpenAI comes from, and Anthropic, I've been in this ecosystem for 9 years when I was living there. They have this mantra, ask for forgiveness, not for permission, right? This is what I did for my books, right? Ask for forgiveness, not for permission. In Europe, we do things differently. At least we want to do things differently, right? How does that translate into what's currently going on?
Yeah, it's a complicated issue because besides this ask for forgiveness or for permission, I think this kind of behavior is encouraged in the way copyright law works in the US versus in Europe, because in the US you have to fight against Anthropic personally because of how the fair law doctrine uses. You don't have exceptions to copyright in the US system. You just do. And it's legal until proven otherwise. So you have to fight if you want to have your rights as an author protected. In Europe, we have a different way to do things. You have strong copyright. Copyright is far more important as a protection of the author in Europe, and specifically in France. We have a very romantic way of apprehending copyright. There is a strong bond between the author and its work. So, and there is this strong right, and then there is a list of exceptions, and whether you comply with one of these exceptions or you don't. And for when about collecting data, and what Common Core is doing is using the text and data mining exception. The text and data mining exception is an exception written back in 2019, and it's not meant for AI model training. It's meant for big data analysis. So there is a case about, is a text and data mining exception the right way to collect data? Can you just use this exception to collect data? I personally think it's not the right way to do it. So we can see there is this kind of tension in Europe and in France between maintaining our legal framework, which is a strong framework, particularly regarding copyright, but it's maybe too restrictive to authorize the development of AI in Europe, and such Mistral, for instance, and Mistral is really proactive about how they can work with authors to share the values they are creating, etc., because they know the current framework is too strict for them to develop inside of it. And we are starting in Europe to have this kind of economic approach of copyright that tends to merge with how the US is working, but it's kind of an uncertainty in, it's not sure about how we have to do it to achieve a strong regulatory framework that allows the development of competitor to the US solution. So yeah, there is a lot of tensions currently.
Tom, I've seen you taking the microphone, so maybe you have the right to offer a response.
Itching to jump in there. So the TDM exception thing that you mentioned, Vincent, is well, it comes from a time before LLMs. It comes from a time before what's happening now, which, along with things like the robots exclusion protocol and any other mechanism that currently exists, it renders them all obsolete, I guess. Not entirely, because they still have useful passages, they have useful parts of their mechanisms, but there isn't anything that exists right now that is the sufficient tool to allow publishers or content creators or anyone who's a rights holder to actually specify, to signal what it is that they're okay with happening with their data or with their property. So
I don't know, the economical aspect that Mistral is promoting and others are for now ideas, and you don't know exactly how to reattribute. One number I can give you is that, again, I'm sorry, I'm talking about my books again, but when my books on O'Reilly, the author, have been launched, they have been sponsored. So a sponsor paid $160,000 to have the right to distribute it for free online for 6 months. $160,000. We as author, we earn 25%. So we have co-authors, so we shared 40,000. The fine they get for putting it unlawfully in their data set is 3,000. So just imagine, but someone paid 160,000 for 6 months, so just to give you some numbers, right? After you decide about how you judge that. So before the questions, as Eclipse Foundation is one of the largest foundations in Europe, governing Europe, right? And the thing is, you manage the long term. You help project to be managed on the long term with the right governance. So you own the longer time here than maybe sometimes entrepreneurs and stuff. What's your take on this?
Yeah, so just before that, I think that at least we know the price of a good story against Anthropic. That's like 6,000 euros, something like that, because you had 2 books. We know the price of a good story of a fight with Anthropics.
Yeah,
it's 6,000 euros.
Yeah. In my YouTube show, I showed the letter. It's 3,000 per books, and I'm fighting for 6,000. I'm refusing 6,000 to fight.
Oh, that's.
I'm paying.
I think that's a wonderful story.
I'm paying to fight.
I love it. I love it. Yeah. Well, just about trust, and I would maybe disagree with Tom when you say that it's enough to be open. Then we can have trust when it's open enough. I think that sure. openness is important, but you build trust with governance, and you need to have an established governance around open artifacts, because that's the governance, the rules of who can update this open data, who can decide what's in it, what's not in it, etc.
That's fair.
Yeah, so that's our job. You said that we are an open source foundation, and our job is definitely, it's not sexy, but our job is to do the governance for projects. And what it means is that on open source, for the moment, we have more experience, like 25 years of experience on open source software. But we really mean that open source projects we manage are managed in an open, transparent, meritocratic, and vendor-neutral way. And that's something that, of course, all our policies, the IP policies, Eclipse development process, etc., everything is online, so a lot of people try to copy it. But the trick is that the secret sauce is not in the document. The secret sauce is in the document, but also the people who have been applying that for 20 years and know where to stick to the document and where to be and when to be relaxed and say, okay, do this. Or sometimes we even deviate from the documents because we have members who are smart enough to play by the letter, but not by the spirit of the document, and we have to tell them, no, that doesn't work like that.
Nope.
So building vendor neutrality, building trust, it's the thing we do, for example, when we are moving to AI now and creating and launching our AI interest group. It's really gathering a community of the willings of people who want to, well, imagine what we can do in this context of being incorporated in EU and of course doing stuff that has to be compliant with the AI Act by design and at all cost. And Paneval also is our aspect of sharing the burden about evaluating models and making sure that what we do in Europe and what we share in the European with the European ecosystem is okay.
And if you allow me, Tom, the thing is, you say that at least you have a technical trust by design, on the web you're open. Still hear me? Yeah. Okay. Good. That governance trust is important. So it's a chain. We say it's a supply chain of trust, right? From the data sets, the reuse of the data, the license, the governance, the people. But not all foundations are as trusted as Eclipse Foundation. Just to let you know, and some are more vendor-driven. So yeah, it's a chain. It's a full chain there. So we have time for questions from the audience. We have one question here, two questions. I will take these two questions first, if that's fine. If someone can bring the mic here. Run.
Catch.
If you know the meme, run. Tariq was the first, and then you second.
It's very interesting. I had first a small correction. My original quote was about regulation. It's about, would you trust a flight that has been checked by compliance officers or technicians? That was another joke, but
it's great, open source, like direct feedbacks, right? So thank you very much.
That's exactly what it is. The question is, we're talking a lot about open source AI as if humans are going to talk to a chatbot. This is kind of a 2023 question. And now we're moving into agentic. And the question I have is, it's a genuine question. I've been thinking about it through the conversation is there, knowing that most of the interesting agentic products are actually being built in Europe, well, some people leave to the US, but there's an interesting ecosystem. Is there a possibility that we actually can build open system that works well with agents? Because having a proper model is one thing, but having agents working and behaving in a proper way, like you talked about the European way, is going to be a real challenge. And I wonder if this can work together, and what's your thoughts on how the next level of models will deal with agentic?
Thank you. And we'll take also the question now, so we feel the context window.
Yes. My question is quite simple. There are two ways, actually, in 2026. The first one is the fact that we are transforming ourselves from AI producer to publishers with the rise on the success of the generative engine optimization. Beside that, we've got another way with the agentic. It means that we are transforming ourselves to more industrial producers. So, in relationship with the law and the regulation, if we are transforming ourselves from one sector to the other, how do you figure out the way to regulate it?
So the regulation between two different industries, or
I think this is the issue because we are leaving the IT world on the computer science world to go directly to the publishing on the industrial sector. And we know that actually, for the regulator, there are two sectors. And we are leaving the third one. So how can we figure out the relation of the intersection of the three sectors?
Okay, so first about the agents, like what does that change? An agentic word, agentic AI, agentic orchestration, like agent cooperation, stuff like that. What does that change? Who want to jump in?
Yeah, well, I think that there are two aspects. One aspect is that we have the technologies and then we have the regulations. And, in open source, at some point, people started to say, hey, we need ethical license, etc. And we have a very good blog post that say, hey, we need to obey the law, whatever the technology. And so we don't need to change the licenses. We need to just make sure that people locally obey the law. And I think that with agents, at some point, we need to also, using agents doesn't allow you to do any so much illegal stuff. But there is another aspect, and I would be interested in continuing the conversation about that, is that maybe we also need to build our own agent framework that are compliant by default or that integrate our values, because I think, I don't know, I'm not a philosopher. I know there are a couple of philosophers in the room, but I'm not a philosopher, but I think that technologies are embed culture, and that, of course, if we don't have our own, if we don't show enough leadership with our own technologies that we have produced, then we just have to digest the cultures of others. So.
Anastasia, you wanted to jump in?
Yeah, I'll go back to Tarek's question. Because I think that actually the open source approach has never been as topical as for actual agents. And I think one important thing here is how you see what the agent is. Because on my side, what I'm seeing is the agent is actually the model which has embedded the agentic capabilities through planning and action into the weights. For me, the agent is not just the harness around it, and we can actually see with the real agentic models, such as Opus or others, that through the releases, the Opus or the Sonnet for that instance, and the Anthropic engineers explain it very openly in their technical blog posts, that they have been absorbing more and more of the harness, which was first facilitating, right, a bit stupid of a model to act as an agent into the weights, okay? And this is where I think open source approach is becoming so important, because if the model is the product and it has this agentic behavior, behavior, we need to actually understand the latitude of the latent space which has been developed through the training and with the training data, at least in terms of its provenance, etc. So when I'm hearing about, for example, the new grok being trained on over 100,000 synthetic environments in order to obtain the agentic capabilities in coding or in function calling, whatever, my question is, as for example, as the industries, right? If I'm, for example, in the automotive industry, if I am to deploy grok internal, like, I mean, through the API, for example, or whichever, which is kind of strange, but let's imagine, okay, let's take another example, which is even better. If there is, for example, a Chinese model, right, which has good agentic capabilities, it's open weights, and I want to deploy it on premise. If I don't have access to the training data, how am I to be actually able to do the stress test, for example, for security? And when I say security, it's not about what, like, our Ministry of Finance was saying, ooh, there are Chinese biases, the models respond badly about Tiananmen. You don't care about this. What you care about is once it's an industry, and if it's agentic behavior, you need to do the stress tests. You need to be sure that there are no Trojan horses which would affect your infrastructure, right, which induce critical insecurity when you deploy these models. And for this, you need to actually have this trust, and you need to have auditability, which comes with the disclosure of the training data, at least its provenance and the most important details. So I think that for the agents and for them to be actually deployable in industry, and this kind of joins the second question, we need open source. And I think that most of the critical industries have been always very much keen on the open source, and there is a reason for this. And this reason is specifically the security, etc. So. Yes.
We have last minute, and Vincent, I've seen you.
Yeah, I'll be quick. I just want to add something that about agent regulation. The main difficulty I see is that in order to regulate what agentic model can do, we have to define, we have to have a legal definition of what AI model are. And in the AI Act, there is no definition of what a model are. And that's the main issues I'm fighting with right now regarding open source definition, because open source subject on AI, because without knowing what a model is, you can really know or license from the data we apply to the model or to the output. So that's a question. So open source is already asking the main question that would be the main issue regarding agentic model. We have to know, we have to legally define what a model is.
Really, just yes or no, if you can. Does Vincent, is the AI Act ready for agent things in the regulation or no? Or we'll have to wait again, whatever amendment of AI Act?
I'm not sure what I'll say no.
Ah.
Maybe we can take the risk approach from AI system and translate it to agentic model, but it's based on AI system and not AI model, so there's still this gap of what a model is.
Okay, it seems we're late on the regulation. Will be late again. So okay, thank you very much. Thank you for this. We can have a warm applause for them.